Arlene, Jeff, Gary, who's gone, Mark, who's gone, Ken, myself. And sometimes we think, okay, if I had that job, I'd be doing God's work. Hope so. That's kind of one of the requirements. But did you know it's also one of the requirements that if you are a machinist, if you're an engineer, if you're a doctor or a teacher or a parent, if you're a retiree, your job is your ministry. We are all ministers in Christ Jesus. And whatever we do, we are to do to the glory of God. Now imagine if you got up on Monday morning and you say, you know what, I can't wait to get back to my ministry. Because I've got this guy standing next to me and I don't particularly care for him, but I need to change that somehow. I'll give you probably one of the neatest ministries I've ever done. Worked for a place during college at a place called Holland Hitch. Holland Hitch is a machine shop. Basically makes hitches for naval vessels. Now it also makes fifth wheels. It also makes a number of other very big parts. I had this very complicated job when I was in college. I took these hitches, that you tie the ropes up on naval ships. And see, they put those together as two pieces, and then they heat them and bring them together. And what that does is it leaves a little bit of the metal around where it seams together. And I had this very complicated job. I had this huge belt grinder. Looked like a huge sander is what it was. And my job was to take that part and to turn it every which way and make sure that all of those burrs and all of those pieces were sanded off. And if I didn't pay attention, even though they gave us gloves, craziest thing in the world, they give you cloth gloves to protect your hands. I learned very quickly it only took hitting that belt grinder 2 or 3 times before that cloth glove was no longer there. But if you didn't pay attention long enough, then what you found is you made a human sacrifice. You flip through and then all of a sudden all the skin is off your knuckles. Happened to me a number of times that summer. But the most interesting part of that job was not working on that grinder. Seriously, it really wasn't all that great of a job. Certainly didn't require much intellect. Certainly didn't require much relational skills. Didn't require much of anything other than could you turn the piece and not get your fingers into the belt. And it had its own rewards for not getting your fingers in the belt. But right next to me was another guy who was not a Christian, not a believer. He knew that I was a seminary student. One of my other co-workers ratted me out. And so he spent most of his day talking to me and saying, okay, what about this? Would God do that? How come this happens? Now, do you know how hard it is to concentrate on making sure your fingers don't get caught in the belt when you're answering people's theological questions? But it was the most meaningful time that I had because that was one of the last times before I graduated from seminary that most of my acquaintances now were from unbelieving circles. Now, most of you probably have far more unbelieving friends and neighbors and acquaintances and co-workers than what I do. If you don't believe that, look around this room. How many do you see in this room of that category? Yeah, and you're the ones I deal with. My job is to inspire you to go out and reach them for Christ. You are the ministers that God relies on to bring his gospel into a broken and very stressed out world. So imagine on Monday morning that you're not going in to be a teacher. You're not going in to be a chaplain. You're not going in to be a librarian. You're not going in to be an engineer. You're going in to be a minister. Oh, and by the way, you happen to be an engineer or a chaplain or a teacher or a lawyer or any number of other things as well. That's the tool by which God is going to proclaim the gospel through you. Now, if we can make that shift, imagine what that does to our jobs. These tireless, meaningless jobs. These jobs that we go to that we hate. These jobs where we really don't like the people suddenly become a mission field. They become a place where we can act out our faith, when we can share the gospel in what we do, even more than what we say. Every day ought to be spent in service for God. And you can do that wherever you are. Ephesians 6 was the passage that talked about slaves. Now imagine if we just changed that a bit and said masters were bosses, slaves were workers. Workers, respect your bosses. Honor them, bring integrity to them, not just to their face, but all of the time, even when they're not looking, as though you were serving Christ. That too would change the world, wouldn't it? One guy that did that was Daniel. Daniel served under Nebuchadnezzar in exile. When he did, kind of rose to the top. Daniel was just that kind of guy. Whatever Daniel did, he did as unto the Lord, it says. And even though he was working under a foreign king, even though he was in captivity, even though he was literally that slave, he did everything as though he were doing it for God. And soon Nebuchadnezzar took notice, and he raised Daniel to the top of the pecking order. And then Nebuchadnezzar was gone, and King Darius comes on the scene. Darius, too, takes notice of Daniel. And Daniel, once again, raises to the top. He becomes good friends with Daniel, but through some trickery, through some conniving, through others who weren't all that particularly interested in the job as much as the rewards. A rule was made that those who did not bow down and serve the king would be thrown into the lion's den. Daniel said, I can go only so far and no further. And I will respect my God above all else. Imagine if we came into every work environment and said that. Some of us would get fired, wouldn't we? Maybe that'd be okay. Some of us might lose our jobs. Some of us might have to just leave our jobs. Some of us might transform our jobs by respecting what it is that God would have us to do rather than what others are dictating that we do. We would be that witness in more of a sacrificial way. And no, you cannot come back and say, well, I'm living a sacrificial life in my work. I have to work with this most horrible person on earth. No, that's not what it means by being sacrificial. Change their life. Pour yourself into them fully. Love them, respect them, encourage them. That's more sacrifice, isn't it? Daniel's thrown into the lion's den. But because Daniel stood with God, God stood with Daniel. morning, the king is very concerned, very worried about Daniel. And he comes and he checks on Daniel, and he